Hi, I'm Melanie Ann Phillips, and this is the next episode in my series called Narrative Theory, in which I take a narrative concept in fiction, drop it like a pebble in a pond, and see where the ripples go out into such areas as psychology, sociology, biology, and physics. So it's kind of freewheeling. We're not trying to actually create a course to teach you anything, but just to show you the extent of how narrative affects all aspects of our lives. All right, we've already done a few of these. One of them that was very popular was character. We dealt with the big topics first, and so the next big topic I'm going to deal with is plot. Now, plot in fiction, let's talk about that first, and then see how it spreads out into the real world. Okay, plot in fiction. What is plot? Well, the first thing you might say is it's what happens in a story. And that's actually surprisingly accurate, because everything that happens in a story, including character growth, or the development of thematic message, or the evolution is the best word, of the genre as it changes until the personality of the story is fully revealed, all of those things are events that happen. What happens in the story. But if you limit it to just events, you tend to look at there was an earthquake, this person shot that person, and of course that ignores all of the motivations why they did it, and how the things that another person did affected the way this person felt, which led them to these other actions. So just what happens in the story is pretty good, but it's also not complete, because that's the temporal side, the time side of what plot is in fiction. The other side of it is what the story is about. What's the story about? And you expect to hear the plot. Well, it's about a guy who's got this chip on his shoulder because of this thing, and then something happens that leads him to take this action, and in the end, here's the goal, and this is what the requirements are, and he has to get a group together and do stuff, and it's partly how things are arranged, the dramatic potentials of the story, and also dealing with the happenings that occur, the sequence of events. So, if you look at it from a pure theory standpoint, narrative theory, that doesn't have any subject matter in it. We're talking in narrative theory, not whether they're going after the stolen diamonds, but the fact that they're going after something to possess it. Now, it could be going after a diploma. It could be going after someone's love to win it, okay? If there is something that you're trying to possess, or conversely, to get rid of, that's one kind of a story. But another kind of story might be about trying to become a better person. Now, you could say that becoming a better person is really trying to achieve a certain quality of being. And that's true. So the choice you're making when you're designing a structure or analyzing a structure is not to look at something as saying becoming couldn't be seen as obtaining something couldn't be like becoming something, but which way do you want your readers or audience to look at it? What are you trying to say in your story? Is this about the process of evolving oneself, or is it about the achievement of something at the end? That difference creates a different kind of plot. And so, looking at fiction, we can find that there are a number of elements of plot that pertain to what the story is about, and a number of elements that pertain to how the story evolves. For example, a story in fiction will have a goal. It will have a clear goal if you are doing the storytelling, or it looks like nobody's really sure why everybody's doing anything. Even if it's a MacGuffin like Hitchcock used to use, where there was a stolen necklace and the idea is to recover it, that kicks off the story, but it's also the goal. The goal is to recover it. But the goal may not be the most important thing. Perhaps it's what happens along the way that's important, but it still has to have a goal. All right, so a goal is important. Requirements for the goal is important. And you'll also find that beneath requirements are prerequisites, another kind of dramatic term. What are prerequisites? Well, if the goal is to stop the famine, and the requirements are to gather 5 different mystical stones and put them back in the idol, then for every stone there may be different prerequisites, such as crossing a desert and needing to get camels and needing to get a guide, or trying to find a map in the National Archives that is rumored to have the location of one of these stones that's in a private collection. And so you can see how a plot can easily get very complex just with a simple goal of trying to stop the famine and the simple requirements of trying to get these 5 stones that will be put in the idol, and then magically the famine will be over. The real meat of the story, what gives it its personality, is what happens in the prerequisite level. But there's not just prerequisites. Okay, I'm back again. I have interruptions here because I'm just recording in a house with other people in it, and sometimes things go a little bit bonkers. So I'm back. Where I left off, I think, or a good place to cut back into this, is we were talking about the goal and the requirements and the prerequisites. And we were pretty clear on what that was before I got interrupted. So the next thing is to say that it's not just goal, there's also a counterpart, consequences. Consequences can be what happens if the goal is not achieved, like the dam breaks and people die from a flood. Or the consequences can be something that already exists that the goal is trying to get rid of. For example, people living under the yoke of a tyrant, and that will continue if the goal is not met. It will continue forever. So we have goal and consequences that are there, and then over here we have requirements, and requirements are the counterpart is the forewarnings. And the forewarnings of the consequence are the things that let you know that the consequence is getting near, just like the requirements let you know that the goal is getting near, the achievement of the goal is getting close, or the consequence is getting close. And these two things together, of the requirements and the goal, and the consequence and the forewarnings, kind of help create your tension in your story. One of them shows you're getting near, but is it as fast or fast enough to avoid the forewarnings that will cause this? For example, the forewarnings are cracks in the dam. The more cracks you get, the more the water starts spraying out, the more chunks keep falling off. That lets you know that that's going to be occurring soon. And it is really a chase between achieving the goal or suffering the consequences. But below that's that final thing, that prerequisites that we talked about that are very important to giving you the meat of your story. There's a counterpoint there too, and that is the preconditions. Prerequisites and preconditions. So we have consequences, forewarnings, and preconditions on this side. Those preconditions are, you need a prerequisite of a camel to cross the desert to get the stone to be able to put into the idol. Okay, so you have this prerequisite of having to cross the desert. On this side, you've got the guy who has the only camel in town, and he insists that you take his troublesome daughter or son along on the trip, or he won't give you the camels. Now, the prerequisites are logistic needs in order to try to meet the requirements to achieve the goal. And over on this side are the non-essential, but because of somebody's preference, somebody's insistence. It's the human factor that says, I want it this way, and I won't give you what you need for your prerequisites unless you satisfy my preconditions. And as a result of that, the preconditions then are balancing off those prerequisites and making it difficult and giving more time for the forewarnings, which could lead to the disaster of the consequence, versus the prerequisites, which will lead you on to the requirements and to achieve the goal. Now, that's kind of the basics. There's a lot of other things that determine how fast and slow the story goes. Story points that determine that, or ways of judging how far along in the story you are. That's part of plot. There's all kinds of story elements, and we'll cover them in other episodes. But let's talk a little bit about the temporal aspect, the flow of the story. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the flow of the story is not just this is what happens in the story. It goes beyond that to the development of a character's arc, to them reaching perhaps a point of a leap of faith, or sticking with their guns and deciding to not change in order to be able to overcome obstacles against all odds. That is valid too. Even the development or evolution of your genre, so that it creates the context in which your story happens, giving it its final brushstrokes of meaning by the end of the story because of the genre. It's not just a bunch of requirements. I'm writing in a horror genre romance. It's got to have these elements. It's got to have these relationships. It's got to be set in this location. All of that together creates the personality. That's what genre is. It's the overall personality of your story, or your story's mind, as if it were a single individual, which is what the Dramatica theory that I co-created with my partner Chris is all about, is seeing every story as a single mind in which all the different characters are facets of that overall personality. And that, of course, matches what happens in real life when we all come together to a common purpose and we end up having a group mind, whether we're fans of a particular show, or we are devotees of a sports team, or whether we are a political party or identify us by our state of birth, or whatever we do. We create these group minds with every club we join, with every team we're a part of. We're the Millers, okay, as a family. That creates a group mind in which we all feel a sense of what it is to be a Miller and what our role is in it, just as characters feel what it is to be part of the story and at the same time know what their role is in it. And so we're looking at all of these aspects of genre and theme and character and plot per se, which are just the events by themselves. There was an earthquake, this guy shot that guy. The temporal progression of this over the course of the story, all right, is divided into chunks, as it were. There are acts, you're all familiar with those. There's sequences in which they're like dramatic movements, or movements in a symphony, where a particular mood or perspective or point of view, it's more nebulous than just an act. Acts are more based on what's going on, and when we've completed it, we move on to the next act. Sequences are kind of the flow, and it operates at a different time frame than the acts. And below that are the scenes. What specific scenes are occurring within those acts, within those sequences. And finally, within each and every scene, there are beats, specific beats. And from a structural standpoint in narrative theory, you can actually label what these beats are that have to happen in a scene, and then the order in which they occur creates the meaning of that scene and propels you on to the next. I'll just give you a hint, we'll talk about these more later, is that within a scene there are 4 primary beats you have to have, and that's the potential, the resistance, the current, and the power or outcome. It's an electrical circuit, only it's a dramatic circuit. And that dramatic circuit tells you what the dramatic potential is, what it's fighting against in terms of the resistance, the current, which is the interaction, and the power, which is the outcome of it, which then creates the potential for the next scene, driving the story forward. And later on, when we get more deep into the functioning of individual scenes and talk about beats, we'll give you specific examples and show you how it all works, so you can either recognize it as an analyst or create it in your own story. So let's put a cap on the fictional side of it right here and say, we've talked about the goals and consequences and all of those things that make up the spatial thing. What's the story about? And now we've talked about the temporal progressions that lead to a leap of faith character arc, development of the theme, development, evolution of the personality until we set the context by which to appreciate the story, so that your message then has that spin on it, that final spin that says, here is how we're supposed to look at this. All of those things are the movement forward. Let's leave fiction behind and now move to the real world. What's going on in stories is kind of as if you looked at your own mind and took your own thoughts and exploded them outward, projected them outward. Oh, I like a better level of exposure if I do that. I'll keep my hands up here. How's that? Okay, so anyway, working with the real world, it is the psychology of the story mind, which represents the psychology of any one of us. And the characters are the things that go on in our head. Our logic, there's a logic character. There's a passion or emotion character, and they play against each other. Sometimes they agree when you're in real life, and what makes sense also feels right. Fantastic! Those are the good times. Celebrate. But when it feels really right, but your logic says this doesn't make any sense at all, or it could even be a bad thing, well, now you got a conflict between those two parts of yourself, an inner conflict, okay? Or it could be that this makes total sense, but I hate it. I don't want to do it. Okay, so those are the kinds of conflicts just two of the archetypes will create that. There's other archetypes like your faith versus your doubt, you know? It's kind of like self-confidence and self-doubt are represented in those things. Can we do it, or can I do it? Can I not? Oh, and another thing you get as a free bonus, I don't know if you can hear it or not, is we're under the flight path. And so because these are off the cuff, good information, professional quality information, but very unprofessional recording studio situation. So when the planes go by, sometimes they're a lot louder than that. Now, I have to take a pause because I can't even think. All right, so when we're looking at the real world and talking about psychology, every story has a mind of its own. And that mind has the elements that make us up. We have skepticism on one side, where we have and you see when groups come together, they automatically self-organize into a macroscopic version of what goes on in each of our heads. They form a psychology in a group. You'll see somebody emerge as the voice of reason. That's the logic, okay? There's somebody emerges as the passionate voice of what feels right. And then you have the resident skeptic who, whatever comes up, they're looking at, well, that's not going to work, or I don't believe that, or something of that nature. These are all the qualities we have within ourselves, and that's why there are these archetypes. Oh, here's an even louder plane. 2 bonuses for you. Oh, let's see the time it is. Oh, yeah. Oh, my gosh. You're just in time for the 10 a.m. rush, so we're going to have a few of these. I'll have some coffee until it's gone. Sorry. That stuff on the bottom. I've heard that when you make a French press cup of coffee, all those oils that are floating on top and in there, that stuff raises your triglycerides through the roof. Don't care. I love the coffee and the French press. All right. So, plane is gone. So you have the story mind psychology, and you have these characters who represent the facets, and theme represents our value standards that we have. We're always weighing, is this the way to look at it? Is that the way to look at it? What's the moral choice, the proper choice, the comfortable choice? All of those things are part of theme, and they're represented externally to ourselves in the story. And the story itself is the psychology of the whole mind. We don't see it because we're looking at different people doing different things, feeling different things, trying out different moral standpoints within this particular genre. We never realize that it's really just a large psychology, the exploded mind of the human, okay? And so that's why everything that we see in stories pertains to psychology. For example, in plot, we can often look at Hamlet, okay? Hamlet wants to get revenge for his father's death. He knows who did it. He has opportunity, but he keeps thinking, well, if I kill him now, he'll go to heaven because he's in prayer, and therefore my revenge will not be satisfied. What kind of revenge is that? And so he continually overthinks the plumbing until he totally screws it up and it turns into a tragedy at the end. We do that in our own lives, and the main character often represents, since it's who we feel the story is about, whose shoes we stand in or look over his shoulder, like Scrooge. We're interested in how he's going to decide. We're also interested in whether the goal is achieved, especially in action pictures, and that's a protagonist. A protagonist is the character who's trying to achieve the goal, whereas the main character is the one who the decision point or character growth or choice revolves around. All right, so don't want to go too much into that, but you can see how it deals with the psychology of it all. And moving on also, we realize that it deals with society. As I mentioned, groups come together, and you have Apple Computer, for example, and Steve Jobs was the head of it, or you have somebody who represents the hero of a particular thing or the star of a particular show, and those people then become the iconic representation, the avatar for the group mind as a whole. I'm writing a series of novelettes right now. It's called The Event, the whole series, and it covers 24 books, of which I've done 6, and it's a science fiction thriller, and one of the key elements of it is how these group minds form, and how all of the entire planet can be thought of as a large group mind in which the nations are, in fact, characters. Some years ago, over 10 years ago, we were working for the government. We first had a contract with the NRO, who heard about our work, and they wanted to hire us to analyze what was going on with other nations and what was going on with terrorists, and see if we could create a narrative form of what the story was about, and then also project forward how it might evolve through time, and say what's happening in this story, so that we could predict. They said don't use the word predict, use the word project. Predict it, you have to be absolutely accurate. Okay, project. Okay, so we could project what terrorists might do. Lone wolf terrorists. We could do retroactive analysis, and we could do current projections to say, here's a red flag. If you see this combination of things, and this is the next one in the sequence, that's where you gotta be worried, and it's an easy thing to see. So we worked for the NRO, more on a global level with relationships with different nations, friendly and unfriendly. And then we worked for the CIA for a while, doing a lot of work on terrorism, and we worked for the NSA, recognizing patterns that might be happening in the world that we wouldn't see, and how we could target. I wrote a paper called something like Targeting Informational Gathering Resources Based on Narrative Expectations, or something like that. It was a white paper I did. You can see that there is this social aspect that goes just beyond how people are going together. I suspect that with the modeling we did 30 years ago, from which we found the DNA of narrative, of the psychology of narrative, it's the internal equivalent of DNA, or if DNA describes the body, this narrative system we found, Dramatica, we actually called it the story mind, and then we later labeled it mental relativity, because it had some of the same things that you see in physics. Why? Because we're all in the same physical universe. It's not surprising that our minds would have roots in the equivalence, the process equivalence of the mind, as to what happens in physics. So the mind, for example, is a machine made of time. Every gear and pulley is a process, not an object. And these processes relate to one another the same way objects relate to one another in the external world. So we'll get into that more. I even have already done one called The Physics of Narrative, in which I briefly touch upon some of this stuff. But we're talking about plot. So plot can be physical processes. You can say this is what happens, or it could say how these things work together. And the reason we see them work that way is because those are the patterns our mind is capable of perceiving. And in fact, there may be all kinds of stuff going on around that we can't see within our 4 dimensions of our mind. Remember, externally we have mass and energy and space and time. And here in our minds we have knowledge and thought and ability and desire. They are the 4 bases of the DNA of our minds, just as those are the 4 bases, mass and energy, space and time, of the physical universe. In stories we have an advantage, because in the universe we can only see it from the inside looking out. But when we're looking at minds, not only can we experience from the inside out in our own mind, but we can also see what other similar minds look like from the outside looking in. And so, I don't want to go into too much detail of that at this point, but the whole notion behind this particular recording is to show that plot in fiction has the spatial side, the temporal side, and a lot of complexity to it, although you can feel it as a very simple thing, or just wrap it up in a sentence and say this is what the story is about. Okay, but underneath the hood, when we used to work on our cars instead of send them off to the cathedral factory that has magical robots when we actually worked on our cars, we could lift the hood and we could see that all these components are there and this is what's going on. As an author, those are the sort of things you want to need. As a psychologist, you'd want to be aware of it so you can get right to the crux of the matter. As a sociologist, you want to be able to handle that so that you can know what the stock market is going to do, know how the economy is going to move. All of those things are events can affect them in the physical world, like an unavoidable famine or a fire or something like that, but what happens from there is all human element, and that's what we were doing for the government with the work we did. So what does the human element have to say about that? All right, so coffee. All right, so wrapping up, I really am going to stop sometime after this airplane. Yeah. Okay. Don't complain too much. You get this for free. If the information is good, it's well worth it, even if you have to climb through all this stuff to get at it. Bring a machete next time, okay? You can fast forward anyway, right? I can't. All right. So, the whole point of this is to say, in terms of narrative theory and plot, which is what this episode is about, we looked at it first in fiction, and we saw what the story was about and how the story proceeded, and even went down so far as talking about beats and dramatic circuits and such things as that. Talk about character, theme, plot, genre. And then we said, here in psychology, this is how it happens in our own minds when we have decisions to make, when we're playing one thing against another, when our morality says one thing and our sense of what's expedient in plot that we're figuring out what to do, says something else. And then when we went beyond it to society, and we talked about group mind and how all that works conceptually. And I'll give you very good examples of that later from some projects we worked on for a sports team to try to meld a team with individual hero members who are superstars, how you could create a single identity for the team, a group identity in which they were willing to not serve what was best for them as a star in order to serve what was best for the team. It's an interesting story. I'll give you that later. And then finally in physics, we just barely touched on physics about how that works. And in biology, well, there's a story for you. I haven't talked much about biology, but the actual functioning of the mind itself at a biological level, fascinating subject, doesn't really apply here too much, so we're going to save that for another one. That's it for this time. I hope you had a taste of how plot isn't just, this is what happens in a story. Okay, it's much more than that, and it affects our lives on a grand scale as well. Oh, I like that. I'll have to remember that movement. All right, that's it. Melanie Ann Phillips signing off until next time, and until then, may the muse be with you.